Hey everyone, it's Bob. Welcome back to the show. On this episode of Elevate Your AIQ, I sat down with Agi Garaba, Chief People Officer at UiPath, to explore the evolving intersection of HR, automation, and agentic AI. As a tech industry veteran and people leader at an automation company evolving to be an agentic AI company, Agi literally sits at the epicenter of the modern workplace. She shares how UiPath is navigating the shift from RPA, that's robotic process automation, to intelligent digital agents with a human-first approach that prioritizes trust, governance, and employee engagement. We talk about reskilling, organizational design, and why AI literacy is now a critical part of workforce readiness. You won't want to miss Agi's thoughtful insights on how to build a more responsible and human-centric future of work, which is music to my ears. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think you will too. Thanks, as always, for listening. Hello, everyone. I am Bob Pulver, here with another episode of Elevate Your AIQ. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Agi Garaba. How are you today, Agi?
I'm doing very well, Bob. How are you?
Doing well. I'm really excited for this conversation. I know it took some doing to get us to this point, and I'm excited to dive into quite a few topics that are relevant in today's organizations around AI, AI agents, agentic AI, and what all that means for us humans. Before we do that, I thought you could just give my listeners a little bit of background about your career and what brought you to UiPath and your current role there.
Absolutely. So very happy to share a little bit about myself. So I'm Agi Garaba. I'm the Chief People Officer at UiPath. I have been here for 2 years. And all of my career, I had been in high tech. So that's definitely everything I've done has been pretty much in high tech and mainly in HR. I spent the majority of my career, a long time, 16 years at a big multinational at SAP, where I had a really wide range of opportunities, not only within HR, but actually I spent 2 years outside of HR in a COO role, which was a fantastic opportunity to learn some different skills and look at HR from the outside in a little bit, just to see how we can get even better. But my heart took me back into HR because that's really where I feel like I belong. And what brought me to UiPath was certainly the vision of the company. I really like the fact that how we would like to make sure that we enable people to do the best they could because we provide automation solutions for them to take out the transactional, operational things so that they can truly focus their skills and their in their role to do their best in a more creative, impactful way. So certainly the vision of the organization. I also liked that size-wise, it was a bit of a different size to what I was used to before working in a really big organization. I love the size we are at the moment because it's just a very fast-paced, agile environment where if we want to make changes, we can do it quickly. And I just feel like I can have a lot of impact myself in the organization. So, and it's really been a great journey, and I feel like I'm just beginning. And it's also a very exciting time as we are transitioning as an organization from being an RPA, primarily RPA company to an agentic automation leader. So it's also just fascinating to be a part of such a journey from an HR perspective and what that really means for us.
That's great to hear. I think I applaud your efforts to sort of go out and take on a new role to understand a little bit more about obviously how the company operates. I think it's good to get that varied perspective, and I think it makes you a better leader when you come back to your, I guess, your comfort zone a little bit in HR. But the trajectory of UiPath is really interesting to me, so I want to explore that. I mean, I've known UiPath since probably in the 2016 or so timeframe when everyone was talking about robotic process automation or RPA, but also recognizing that this is going to get smarter. It's not going to necessarily always be sort of rules-based, right? And you're going to get into more intelligent automation and then what some would call, advanced or cognitive automation, which is, I think, where we sort of intersect with AI and AI agents now. But I also want to dig into, your role. I feel like you as a chief people officer, having technical background in terms of the organizations that you've worked at, there's always a tough balance between, HR and IT, and you in this role at an automation and AI company, you're like at the epicenter whatever Venn diagram you want to draw around all these different topics and things like that. So your perspective is invaluable. Talk a little bit about how you see the evolution of that sort of rules based automation to some of the topics that we get into today.
Yes, it's a great point what you made, Bob. What interestingly, what I'm seeing a lot among many of my peers and in the HR profession is how much it's more and more intersecting with technology, and I love being in this space because I feel like I'm not a type of HR professional that's just there to follow what typically falls under HR. It's actually really nice this time that I can really see the bigger picture and how I can contribute to that, or how my team can contribute to that. It's an interesting evolution because there's certainly a big cultural aspect of when as organizations are going down this path of these agents coming out, and as you said, the cognitive automation versus just a very rules-based one, because obviously what it means is that we're going to have very interesting org setups where we're going to have human workers and digital workers alongside of us in the future. So that has a lot of very interesting implications from an org design perspective. How do we make sure that the human workers are well enabled to work very efficiently alongside the digital coworkers and not fearing having them as part of the workforce? That I think is one of the biggest aspects of leading HR and culture right now in many organizations as they go down this path is how do we make sure that we create the right level of excitement, curiosity, and risk-taking among our employees and our leaders so that we get into these transformations with that mindset versus the fear of all of these agents are just going to be taking away jobs, and it just means that we're going to have a workplace that lacks empathy because now we just kind of work with digital coworkers versus having human conversations. So it's definitely a journey. Certainly, I know we are on that journey, and I know talking with, again, many of my peers, others are. And it to a certain extent, we are at a good place to start coming as an RPA company because we've always had automation as part of our culture. Even in my HR team, I have over 50% of the team that are citizen developers. That's when they can actually create automations themselves without being a techie, so to say. So we've always had this excitement and see the value of that. I think it's a lot harder for organizations that perhaps don't have that type of a history or a background. So I do feel like we start from we have a bit of a head start compared to some others. Having said that, all of the headwind that many others are seeing, we are seeing as well. So we are certainly not immune to that. So that I think is that very interesting intersection of HR and technology. And in this conference, we had our annual conference earlier this week, and every time we had customers on stage that talked about their journey, who have purchased UiPath and they've gone down the path of agentic automation. One aspect every single one of them mentioned was the cultural piece, how critical that is along this journey. It's really not ultimately a journey that IT leads. It's a business-led journey. Everybody needs to understand in the business leadership role, what are the priorities and why are we doing it? And that transformation has to include the cultural piece with it. It can't just be a purely technology-led transformation.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies are getting tripped up by that. And it's interesting because even as I reflect on some of my own transformation work in big companies, a lot of it did go back to people, right? People and behavior change, and how are we communicating, what's in it for everyone? How are we explaining that we're bringing these advancements to them, and it's not being, sort of thrust upon them in a top-down fashion. So I think, it takes some, I guess, courage to do that, but it's really about, these are the people that have made you successful so far, and these are the people that are going to continue with your successful growth, as well as, of course, understanding where there might be some risks and how we mitigate that. But I think I do agree that you are a few steps ahead. You did get sort of a head start. But that's okay, because as long as you're helping bring others along, which obviously you do just naturally as a vendor, but trust is critical. And the fact that you've been on this journey with a lot of your clients for all of this whole wave, right? But I mean, this goes way before generative AI and this whole agentic conversation, right? And so people have, you've built those relationships, and I feel like trust is paramount to everything that we do going forward. Partly for the job loss fears that you alluded to before. Yeah. The so when we talk about this concept of human centricity, I mean, I think that plays right into the trust theme. But how do you guys approach that, in the sense that, sure, there's people that want to just sort of push the envelope and experiment and implement these things, these agents and things like that as much as possible, especially when you've given people that permission to do so. But at the same time, you've got you've got people that need to train these agents. You've got to basically take some of their own knowledge and sort of encapsulate that and codify that into some of these agents. I mean, what are some of the things that you do to make sure that you make sure people feel like the humans are always going to be sort of valued?
Great question. And there's two aspects I'd like to talk about. One is more around how do we just get them involved as we are building the agents, but the other one is more around the trust and governance in these agents, especially around HR related agents, where they potentially are touching very sensitive HR details, personal details of people. So the first side, which is how do we make sure that they feel like they have some level of input, or that we are consulting with them as we build the agents, is that the approach we have taken is very a grassroots approach, in a sense of even just creating the ideas of the agents. We truly went down to every team, and we basically gave the challenge to everybody in the organization to come up with ideas. Blue sky, just bring any kind of agents that you think that your team could benefit from. So the fact that people were asked to do this was a first really critical step, I think, because ultimately they felt like, well, it's not just that our leadership says that here are the priorities. And some teams, often when you do that, some teams feel like, oh, why are we not a priority? So ultimately, the fact that everybody could generate ideas together and come together with that is a really important piece, because everybody now feels like, oh, I'm a part of it. Well, great. Now we have a whole list of ideas. We have over 500 ideas across the organization. Now we have to think about how do we prioritize it. So then again, we came up with an objective. Some might call it, there's some subjectivity to it for sure. And you have 500, you can't get to everything right away. But we try to come up with an objective way on how do we prioritize that. And we make sure we communicate very regularly to the organization on here's what we are picking, here's how the agents are being developed. So the involvement of the people from the get-go, making sure that we understand what is it that would actually help them in their jobs, not just what helps the organization. And the other piece is this constant communication around how things are going. If we have delays, why do we have it? When do we get to certain things? That's the second piece, to make sure that they feel like they are brought along. When we go to the other side around how can we trust these agents? Ultimately, especially AI or in HR, where we are already very aware of biases when you make decisions. And if you program that bias into an agent, it will continue to be there, right? So there are a few different ways how we do that. First of all, what's really important is to make sure that these agents can have somewhat of a controlled agency, especially around HR topics. So when we are creating them, what do we give them access to? How do we actually make sure that everything that's protected is protected, and we use them the right way? So, for example, we have to also think about legislation around using AI agents and tools, especially in recruiting. Many countries these days don't want a tool to be selecting individuals. They still want individual involvement. So how do we architect it all that the agents are used in the right part of the process, and also that they have controlled agencies so that they don't just do whatever they want and access whatever they can? Now, with agents, what's also critical, Bob, is that we can observe them so that there's some tooling in place and there's some mechanisms that we can actually monitor how these agents are doing. And if there's anything that comes up where you have to bring that human in the loop into the process, that we catch those moments. And we actually have some really cool tooling that measures the accuracy of what the agents are doing, because that's the other piece is you don't just want to build an agent and doesn't matter. They can be hallucinating or doing whatever they are doing, and it's not really serving your purpose. And finally, the final piece around this responsible AI concept is really how do we make sure that all the platform pieces, so not just at an agent level, but also on a platform level, we give the right authorizations, we set everything up the right way. So again, very much protective of the right information and the right processes that only those can access it who really have to have the access. So those are some of the ways where we figured out how to make it so that people trust those agents. But then, as I mentioned earlier, they are also part of creating them and they can really truly input into how they end up, these agents, so that they are useful and people are not fearing that, that they're just going to take away all our jobs and what's now with us. What we are also doing, Bob, is we are making sure we are very clear on what are the jobs internally where the agents will have a bigger impact, because it depends on each role, whether how much we can automate in every role that we have. And those where we see that there is a big parts of a role that can be eliminated, we are now thinking about how do we make sure that we reskill those folks to be able to potentially grow their career in a way that not leaving anyone behind, so that we bring our workforce along the way on this journey, basically.
So that was a lot, and I applaud all of those efforts. I mean, I talk a lot about this concept of like responsible innovation, right? And so part of that is under the responsible AI umbrella, as you alluded to, around risk mitigation and transparency, the explainability of these models, the fairness, and of course privacy and security. But then you're also, as you talked about all those ideas that you got, you're really trying to get people involved, crowdsource those ideas from people who are in the trenches, and looking at data and looking at patterns and seeing where opportunity lies, and then taking a very sort of measured, pragmatic approach to how you prioritize some of those ideas. So I love everything you guys are doing. It's fantastic. One of the things that has come up before around
pace of change in the world of business is fast, and that drives incredible complexity for the world of human resources.
Welcome to the HR Data Lab's Brown Bag Lunch, a series of conversations with experts inside and outside the world of human resources on how to innovate, measure, and evolve our practices.
Our goal is to help provide you with practical examples of how HR has to change and to meet in this complex business environment.
Every week, we'll talk to new and different voices on all aspects of human resources.
And guess what? You get to chat with us live.
Live?
Live.
So they can answer questions or they can ask us questions?
They can ask, they can answer, whatever they want. They get to talk with us live.
That's awesome.
Sometimes we geek out on the data and technology that underlie the processes that drive the world of HR.
But the conversations are always insightful and fun. So please enjoy the HR Data Lab's Brown Bag Lunch.
Gathering ideas from the workforce is, do they know enough about what's possible? And this is another area where I think you guys have sort of a head start. But one of the things for a lot of organizations, I'm curious if this comes up just in your general conversations with clients, and maybe it came up this week at your user conference, but AI literacy and readiness seems to be one of the big inhibitors to a successful, transformation. You can't just throw up, a pile. We're going to pilot this. We're going to pilot that. We grabbed a bunch of stuff, and we just expect people to know how to use it. Or so I guess how do you think about AI literacy and readiness when it comes to both playing defense on the responsibility and the risk mitigation side, as well as playing offense with growth opportunities and innovation?
Absolutely, yeah. So certainly we recognized very early on that even though we are an automation company, still we have varying levels of understanding and knowledge about this. So what we did right away is we ended up creating internal courses. So these were all internally created and curated materials that were different levels of, depending on where people's roles are and how much interest they have it. But for example, we have a 1 hour 101 around agentic automation. So that's really sort of the nuts and bolts and the basics that we encourage every single one of our employees to take, because those are some of the key concepts, the basic definitions that if we use all the time. And then, of course, above it is there are different levels, whether you are in sales and you're trying to sell these solutions. If you are in engineering, it's a very different level of training that we have for folks who already come from a technical background. So what we try to do is to create ways of learning about it on different levels, but definitely have that 101 level that's for everybody ultimately. And we also have been piloting all kinds of productivity tools, whether ChatGPT or other ones, where we give it to all of our employees and say, go and try it out and tell us how it works. And we can provide you some prompt training and things like that on how, because again, if you just have a tool in your hand, but you don't know how to use it, it's just a tool. It's not actually giving you any advantages or advances. So that's generally what we like to do. But even with that, I do find that, and I'm hearing it in so many conferences I've been, and I certainly see it on our own team, is that sometimes the limit is really our own imagination or what we can do around innovation. And I certainly encourage my team constantly, as we were looking at the HR automation ideas, on also just look outside and read everything we can. Luckily, there is just a huge amount of great stuff out, whether it's on LinkedIn or elsewhere, where other companies are sharing what they are doing, attending conferences, and again, asking the right questions. So we have our own ideas, but others also have some brilliant ideas, and we just need to be curious and find those ways how we can. It's an interesting one, because I do find that being quite an advanced tech company in this regard, I do find that there aren't too many other organizations out there that are at that same level. So very often it's more that we are the inspiration for others, which I like as well. Like at a conference, I did have a meeting with another CHRO and their team, and I mentioned some of the ideas we have, and you could see how, like, wow, those are all the things you could do with agentic automation. So I love sharing what we do, but I also know that there are so many other great ideas out there that we can think about bringing it to us and utilizing it as well. At some point, though, I think it comes a point, Bob, where it is, as you said, it's just enough ideas. We've got enough. Now let's just get into actually putting some into production, using it, figuring out, because creating ideas, while we do have limit on our imagination, still we can do a lot of that. But I like it when we bring vision together with execution, and you can actually truly can say, well, we've got these agents in production and this is how they work and here's the impact they've made and here's how, what we learned from that, getting into the next set of agents. So I think we are at that stage right now. Like right now, I have 4 agents in development. One is almost ready for production, the first one of our agentic solutions. And it's just really exciting to be at that stage. But yes, it's nice to be thinking about that execution side, not just the idea generation side as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, can't bite off more than you can chew, as they say. But I am curious about like how you look across those opportunities, because even as we think about agentic, I mean, everyone may have their ideas within their specific domain, but do you try to balance it across, working with your peers? Do you try to sort of find opportunities across different sort of, themes in terms of like, these could be used on the business model side, these could be used in operations, these could be used obviously in talent and HR, maybe some things around governance, things like that. I mean, do you try to sort of spread the wealth and make sure everyone is getting, access and exposure to those opportunities?
So certainly as we collect these ideas, they are visible to everybody. We collect them in a place called Automation Hub that every single employee can go in and see, what are the ideas in another department? Because, that might actually be good. Do we at the moment have a very systemic way to say, here's a really good idea on marketing that later on maybe finance could use. Certainly, I think there's a bit of room to grow in that regard, where we holistically look at it and see, okay, actually, there are some very similar ideas, and if we group them together into one thing, it would be a bigger impact. I do think we have a bit more room there. Right now, we are at a stage where the ideas are there, they are visible, and we are seeing some of those synergies, but I don't think yet we have implemented the perfect system to catch all of these synergies between the different departments. And right now, the biggest focus has been for each department to come up with their own. So I still think, as you said, as the next opportunity is how do you look at it cross-functionally? There are a few where it exists, that cross-functional orchestration, because that's the other thing that our tool can do really well, is orchestrate across different departments. But there's definitely room for us to improve in that regard, for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? You just, the fact that you're just still cranking through it and everyone's active and involved. I mean, that's more than half the battle, I would say. So no, that's excellent. I guess as we think about, that sort of cross-pollination of ideas in different areas, it led me to think about like AI governance and ethics, and how leadership sort of evaluates, different solutions, whether they're, sort of homegrown, grassroots solutions, or even something from another, vendor. As you evaluate these things, are there, well, I guess it's just a general question, like how does that work? Some of this may come naturally just because of who UiPath is and the nature of the work. But I guess I'm just curious how you sort of structure the sort of oversight of all this to make sure you're not overlooking, some specific use cases or disadvantaging a particular, population, and just in terms of like not just risk mitigation in general, but adverse impact and fairness and things like that.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's an interesting one, Bob, because it's such a quickly evolving landscape that I feel like it's really hard when you could just say, oh yeah, we are fully on top of it, because as soon as you say that, something new comes out that's like, oh, another legislation or another thing to think about. So I feel like we're constantly in this sort of bit of a chasing mode on like making sure that we think about everything. But ultimately, the best way, what we found, and we're still working on it, so this is another work in progress area, is to make sure that we have the right systems and roles in place where people know that is their job. So for example, in our legal team, there is a particular role that looks after this. So ultimately, the person's role is to make sure that they follow everything that's happening outside from a legislative perspective, from a practices perspective, and brings that, okay, here are some things that how the legislations are evolving that we need to think about. In my team, I've recently created COE within the HR team that is basically an employee relations, HR compliance COE that works with legal. So this sits in HR, but again, somebody who is creating the right frameworks and systems to make sure that we look through and sort of audit every single one of our processes to say, here's where AI we intersect with. Is this okay? This is what we need to be thinking about. So these two roles ultimately, from more of a HR compliance perspective, the legal role and the person on my team who are working together to create a system, and we are again working on it right now to make sure that it's bulletproof, that we are not missing anything along the way. Now, of course, we then have folks in our security team and in our product teams who are also thinking about it on how are we building the product the right way. But when it comes to just my function generally and how it relates AI to things that we do in HR, those two roles are really critical, and the system that they are building and the mechanisms, checks and balances we are putting in place. Ultimately, it's one of those that, again, it's constantly evolving. So we have to make sure that it's not one of those functions that you created and then take your eyes off it, because it can't be like that. But even just having the right mechanisms in place. And sometimes I'm sure there'll be situations where we won't catch something ahead of time and then we'll have to react and fix and modify. But even just having these right roles and the right mindset is a good start. You mentioned that earlier, that sometimes you don't necessarily have the end state, but that's how we are thinking about it, Bob. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And the mindset piece, I think, is part of that readiness, right? It's not just teaching people, specific skills like, prompting and, vibe coding and, some of these other terms that we hear about. And it's not necessarily about proficiency with a specific tool. Some of it is about that mindset. How is, this is my new, co-pilot or whatever sort of paradigm you want to think about it. But work itself going forward is going to involve this, assistance, this augmentation of some fashion. And I've got to try to, embrace that and recognize that maybe there's some different skills that I should focus on in terms of my learning and development, and which kind of led me to my next topic I wanted to ask you about, which is about skills and some technical hard skills versus sort of human more durable skills, because I think people really need to understand that this isn't just about increasing your productivity and your efficiency. It's about your effectiveness, the reduced time to get answers to questions, to tap into subject matter expertise 24/7, and then but also understanding the risks of, perhaps you and I talked about this before, like there's a potential that people could over rely on AI, which is we need to be careful about.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a hard one. And there's so much to read about this topic these days out there, which really is about if you use AI or productivity tools for the wrong processes that you or the wrong things you're working with, there is a risk that cognitively we're going to lose some of those muscles that we've been working on since we started in school many years ago, right?
Right.
So
Right.
I think it's an interesting one, and I don't know if there is a magic bullet or a very smart guidance I can give on that. I think everybody needs to know themselves really well to understand what are those areas where you are finding, like I'm finding that writing, I used to love writing creatively and just even enjoying the process. But these days, if you could just get something to write you a piece, it's so much easier. But then I'm realizing that if I have to write something on my own, that's actually I'm not as creative, or it's not coming as easily. So I think what we just need to be very mindful of is just knowing yourself and understand when you are finding that these tools are actually starting to impact some of your skills that you either liked doing or you've been very good at and you want to continue using that. So it's really finding that fine line on when do you want to use these tools and in what capacity you want to use these tools, but not to lose your edge as a professional, as because we do want to be able to be better at certain things than AI, right? And that's the critical part on as every one of our jobs will be somewhat impacted by all of these amazing innovations that are coming out. How do we make sure that we stay ahead of the curve? And okay, I'm okay that I'm not going to progress in this area, but what's something else that I can learn instead? So that's the other piece is how do you perhaps replace certain things you were always really good at, but now AI can do it better than you? Fine, I'm just going to pivot into something different. But having that learning mindset and that self-reflection on understanding when it's actually, what, for this particular task, I'm not going to use AI. I'm going to generate ideas myself. Then I can use AI to enhance those ideas or to help me group them or to do something with them. But it's I think that's the tricky part, and that's how it works quite well for me. But again, it's not a silver bullet, Bob, and it's a hard one. I think everybody needs to figure it a little bit out themselves. Having said that, organizationally, we also, I think, have to help people a little bit in this regard, giving learning opportunities and helping through some of these discussions openly on, yes, we have the tools, but don't use them all the time, because ultimately here's what that might lead to down the road. So it's a tricky one for sure.
It absolutely is. And I feel like there's certain tasks that some people like to do. And so it does get into the question of, who's deciding that these tasks should be automated? Do people have a say in the matter? Do they have a choice? Or is it, one or the other? Are we moving forward and there's just no alternative? I think there's a lot of factors to consider when you look at that. But ultimately, part of the question is, or part of the stance that an organization and team needs to take is like, just because AI or automation are capable of taking certain tasks, does that mean we should? It's not just, and part of that is a lens of, part of it is the human-centric lens of the person who's actually executing the task. And part of it is, what is the impact on the workflow and the experience of whoever's data, or, if you're a job candidate, you want to know that your, application and all of your personal data is being treated, fairly, that, someone's looking at this, through that human-centric kind of lens, that you're not just, a row in a spreadsheet, and, you've just got to think through holistically, like what it means to, automate specific tasks, not to mention, like we were just talking about, like the skills. These are skills that I have. So part of it is this work sort of mapping, right? Like jobs to tasks to skills. And
The pace of change in the world of business is fast, and that drives incredible complexity for the world of human resources.
Welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast, a series of conversations with experts inside and outside the world of HR on how to innovate, measure, and evolve our practices.
Our goal is to help provide you with practical examples of how HR has to change to meet the complexity of the business environment.
Every week, we'll talk to new and different voices on all aspects of HR.
And at times, we'll get irreverent.
Silly even.
And sometimes geek out on the data and technology that underlie the processes that drive the world of HR.
But the conversations are always insightful and fun. So please, enjoy the HR Data Labs podcast.
An AI might tell you, okay, here's what you should do, and then give you all these recommendations without the context and the empathy that would say, that's actually not a great idea. That's gonna backfire, because the experience is going to be, degraded, or maybe there's other risks. Because we think, when we talk about risk, just to be clear, for the audience's sake, this isn't just about like legal risk or financial risk. There could be reputational risks if you sort of over automate and take people out of the equation, whether that results in job loss, or it's an inferior candidate or employee experience.
Absolutely. And another piece I think it's important here to think about, there's a lot of talk these days about junior roles, when you just come out of college or university, and how there's a fear that a lot of those will be going away, because quite often as you start in a more junior role, often you do repetitive, transactional things. And why it's interesting is, I was reading about it the other day, how if companies have that mindset that we're not just going to automate all of the junior jobs and that's it. Yes, at some point technology will be able to do that, but you really have to think about the long-term health and succession planning in the organization, because you do want some of those folks to be growing up into mid-career senior roles, but if you end up automating all of that work and you don't have that workforce there ready to grow with you, there's going to be these huge gaps. Then you're going to have to buy talent at that mid-career level, which will not have your context, and they didn't grow up in the organization. It's always good to have a bit of both. As we always say, is that good to have a combination of those who grew up within and can evolve with the organization. Otherwise, the whole concept of loyalty from our employees will just not be there. So there's so much implications beyond that are more long-term, and that's, I think, is something companies need to think about, including ourselves, is what are the sort of short-term gains, but the longer-term potential losses as we go down this path if we don't think through succession planning and what's the type of culture we want to build. Because if it all becomes a very transactional culture, that anything that can be automated, we automate, and we have all these digital coworkers, and we're going to have less and less human workers in the workplace, is that an environment where people want to work in eventually? I'm not sure, right? So those are all aspects to think about as it relates to your question as well.
To your point, there are opportunity costs by making sort of a myopic, view that says, okay, if we do this quarter, our numbers are going to be, fantastic, and shareholders are going to love it, and what have you. But what are the longer term, implications of some of those moves, whether it's, to your point, like attrition or decreased, morale or engagement. I mean, there's some qualitative, metrics that we need to consider. But it also brings up the larger question around strategic workforce planning. I mean, we just entered, fourth quarter of 2025. Everyone should have already started or is about to start their planning sessions for 2026 and beyond. And so these are top of mind questions for not just talent leaders, but line of business leaders and operators who are thinking about what does this workforce. And I don't always like to anthropomorphize the agents and some of the assistants, but they're doing work and they're taking on more and more tasks that were typically done by human talent. And so we need to sort of, it broadens the lens with which we need to look at the talent ecosystem, and then the participants in work, whether that's human labor or digital labor.
It's a good time to think about that, as you said, going into next year. Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that came up just on a sort of recruiting community call this morning was in the recruiting space, right? Where you have, first of all, legally, humans need to be making the ultimate decisions, right? But how much of a recruiter's job, for example, can be automated? Does every recruiter have their own, agent, or is there, a collection of agents within, a talent acquisition department, whether that's in recruiting operations or other places? But what does this mean for, the human element of what made a lot of recruiters get into that space and go into that career to begin with, was the relationships and helping people find successful careers and all of these things. Like what are the impacts of agents coming into talent acquisition as they're starting to do now, and what is I suppose every organization is different, but like what does the ratio look like? You still need human recruiters, but maybe what percentage of that? And yeah, I guess I'm curious about your perspective in that domain.
Yes, yeah, that's definitely an area where already AI exists a lot, even without agents, just because a lot of the recruiting tools, I mean, we recently acquired a new one, and it's got such good built-in AI capabilities that it's really brilliant, and it gives a lot of productivity gain to our teams. And it's an interesting one because with agents, we are just going down the path of thinking through which are the right agents and starting to build them. So currently, I can't say that we have a lot of agents in our TA team as it is right now. It's certainly in the plans, and that's what we're looking at for next year. But we're also thinking about, as we go down this journey, is how do we want to architect the experience of candidates and hiring managers? Because I definitely think there will be productivity gains from these agents in the future, which means that we likely will need generally smaller talent acquisition departments than what we currently have, provided you're not growing. If you are growing, then obviously you will have to grow with it. But I also want to make sure, and we just talked about it earlier, is that whole experience transacting with the company in this regard is not going to become a very disengaging and transactional experience for people. So what I could see that, yes, agents and bots, we already have bots doing all of the sourcing candidates from LinkedIn and helping with the initial screening of resumes. There are even capabilities sometimes out there whereby an agent can summarize an interview. These are some of those really cool ideas that if a hiring manager had an interview with a candidate, the agent looks at the questions and tells the hiring manager that, hey, you know what? This is a more senior candidate. Your questions were more suitable for a more junior one. You need to think about so some of those things that otherwise, the recruiters might have guided the managers on, an agent can do. But I still think that there's going to be very big importance on maintaining relationship with candidates, especially with passive candidates. That these days, we build pipelines because we have jobs that currently might be filled, but we want either a succession pipeline or we know that we're going to grow in that area, but the headcount is not quite open yet. So there's always a group of passive candidates that we have to maintain the relationship, keep them warm. And I think that's going to be, certainly there can be some level of engagement with a digital coworker, but it's so different. I still, when I go to some of these conferences and our TA leads are there and the employees say, oh, I remember when you hired me back years ago and the great relationship we had and we stayed in touch since then. So clearly these experiences stayed with people. It really made a big difference for many of them to actually choose the company to come and work for. So that's how I'd like to see is how do we make sure that we perhaps pivot the recruiter's time spent on sourcing or searching for candidates into that relationship, into the right way of with hiring managers. Again, how can we work with them in the longer term to improve our hiring process? There's always room for that, Bob, as well, on how we can get better at creating that. So yes, I do think there'll be productivity gains. Do I see a fully automated, fully digital coworker-led TA department? That would not be my vision of how I would like to do. Maybe some companies will choose that. Somebody had asked a question from me the other day. Do you think there will be agencies that will have just digital coworkers to, if you need a contingent worker, that you can just have agents there as for that purpose? And I'm sure all of those things are coming, but I'd like to think that there's still a lot of need for human interaction and relationships, and especially when the world is such a difficult, tricky, fast-moving place at the moment, that I still think that those are going to be very critical and important. And I'd like to create a workplace personally, if it was up to me and my vision, where these things are still important.
I love the fact that I totally agree with you, first of all. I love the fact that you called out the passive candidates and the fact that they would definitely need human to reach out to them and stay engaged. And I think that's part of the role of what's defined as like a talent advisor. Like, this is someone who understands the importance of those relationships, who, I don't want to be pinged by a bunch of bots, randomly. Oh, you still looking? Or, are you open to new opportunities? I mean, maybe just that very first initial outreach, but it should immediately be, let me get you to, a human being or what have you. But it's interesting because a lot of the conversations I have, actually even on this community call this morning, it was like, well, if you're an active candidate and your choice is, talking to an agent versus just getting ghosted, like not having an opportunity to share anything beyond the resume that you submitted, most people, I guess, would choose AI over nothing, right? Being ghosted. But right now, I think if you give people a choice between a human and an AI, they'd probably say, I'd like to talk to a human, even though, we're reaching a point where a lot of these AI agents have been shown to have less, bias than a human. But aside from that fact, as a passive candidate myself, if somebody reached out to me, I would expect that to be a human being, which, puts a little wrinkle in how I've been thinking about the power of AI sourcing. But at the same time, once that initial contact is made, I want to know that a human being representing a certain team, a certain organization, is genuinely interested in the value that I can bring to their organization. And so, that gives me a lot more to think about. But I think that's a perfect example of why recruiters that can sort of play that role of talent advisor and really can lean into relationships and not just literally be going through a sort of robotic, process. Those are the recruiters that I think will thrive and will be leading teams of recruiter, human and I guess AI recruiters going forward. It's really interesting.
To a certain extent, it's a little bit like if you think about executive recruiters, right? They often stay in touch with candidates for years as they change jobs, etc. And it's a very relationship-based role, being an executive recruiter, because you have a small set of people that you work with, but you get to know them and you stay in touch with them for years and years. That, I think, how generally the recruiter role will evolve with non-executive levels as well, because you really have to have that type of a relationship sometimes to convince somebody that you are genuinely curious about them and interested in them. So it will be fascinating to see this shift of, I think the transactional work will start shifting out, and not all recruiters will make the shift because it might not be their strength, may not be what they want to be doing. There's an element of a recruiter job that's a sales job, right? Which is that more that hunter on, oh, I'm just going to find the person, but not the farmer who keeps the relationship going. But I think it will become more and more of that farmer piece, and the hunter will be the AI and the tool and all that. So it will be definitely very interesting to see that evolution for sure.
Yeah, no, I love that analogy. And you're right. You're absolutely right. Executive recruiters need to, I mean, they may have their own sort of assistant and their own, team of agents, but the primary relationship is going to continue to be a human being. I agree with you there. I'm just thinking about some friends who have been working with executive recruiters over the last couple of months, and they would have absolutely no tolerance for an AI trying to do that job. It's not out of like arrogance, or I'm above, talking to an AI. It's just the respect and the fact that there's so much sort of nuance and context to all of those, experiences, and yeah, it's just not something that an AI is ready to do. Again, going back to our points before about, the detriment to the experience itself, right? And that's a high value. You could call that a high value target in the hunting context, right? So, Agi, this has been an amazing conversation. I did want to just sort of pivot a little bit as we start to wrap things up, just to get, a little bit about your sort of personal perspective and use around some of these generative AI tools. I was just curious if there are particular, tools or use cases that you find particularly intriguing, concerning, just like what you're seeing, like even outside of work, what you play with and what you avoid, that kind of thing.
Yes, I don't know if I have an example of something that so far showed up for me as very, very concerning. Certainly, there had been situations where I've used these tools in a work context, and there was a bit of that hallucination happening, whereby, I think that's the part that to me is something we just have to be mindful at this stage, depending on what tools we use, is how much you want to rely on that as your single source of information. I love these, we use it very often for us to help us, craft our goals or generate certain ideas or things within my team. So we constantly use it, but we use it as one piece besides other things as well. We still talk through things as a team. We'll still think about generating ideas ourselves as well as what we get from some of these tools. So to me, perhaps that's the biggest learning that I've had along the way is how do we make sure that we, first of all, mindful on which tools we use? Because, if you just use generic ones that are not enterprise grade, that are you going to give it some of your data to analyze your total rewards, salaries in a particular? No, you don't want to do that unless you have an enterprise grade tool that will protect your data. But also just making sure that you use a bit of common sense, critical thinking, maybe double check it in a few different places and like, oh, they gave me this answer. Something's not right with that. Let me just make sure that makes sense. Because we've had scenarios where tools do hallucinate and don't necessarily look at the full context. And the other thing I think is really important is always to use things within context. You mentioned that earlier today, how a tool without context can be really almost dangerous sometimes if you don't keep that in mind. So that's the other piece as well, is that am I giving it enough context, and am I taking what I'm getting from this, putting it into context? No, actually, this guidance doesn't make sense in our environment. Having that courage and that gut check and common sense applied to it, I think it's still very, very important as we use these tools. So that would be, I think, some learning. So far, I haven't had any type of really risky situations where I felt like, gee, this is catastrophic, and luckily, but I'm sure at some point that will come. But certainly had hiccups along the way for sure, where you're like, oof, that doesn't sound right. And sure enough, if you really look into it, it was not the it's just finding that middle ground. But I think it's very important that we are not fearing that, and that's stopping us from using the different tools and what's available for us. It's more just being pragmatic about it and use it where you think, and sometimes just question it too. It may not be the end all to all our questions in one place, basically.
That is definitely true. Thank you so much for everything and for being here and sharing your insights and perspective. This has been a great conversation. So thank you again.
Thank you both for all the brilliant questions as well. I really enjoyed your questions and the way how you were just looking at everything. So thank you for your time as well.
My pleasure. Thank you again. Thanks everyone for listening. We will see you next time.